Hello and welcome to the show. With me today, I have Justin from the Dissident Nomad. Welcome, Justin. How are you?
Hello, Matthew. I'm good. Yeah, it's quite hot here, and yeah,
Where are
I'm
you
doing well
coming from?
today.
That might be good to tell the viewer where are you coming from right now today? Where are you calling from?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I'm in the heart of progressive politics in London, England, in the UK. So North London, to be precise.
I really appreciate you coming on here and talking about our topic for today. We want to talk generally about modernity and then see where it takes us, and then maybe next week we can focus on more particular topics. And before the show, we mentioned the idea of maybe talking about money, the dollar, and things like this. So we're going to save some detail on that topic for later. But first, tell me about you. Tell me about your interests. What keeps you busy? What are you working on right now?
Sure. Yeah. I think I've always been on the right side of the political center. Always taken keen interest in geopolitics, international relations. I remember 9/11 quite clearly. That kind of switched me on. And then, a long time after 2016 came around, there was the Trump election on one side of the Atlantic, and there was Brexit on my side, if you will. And I guess I've sort of always been part of this broader dissident kind of circle of questioning truth and power and the nature of the global economic system and the global political sort of system we have today, really. So I'm a blogger, I'm a Substacker. I'm not that active on the video platforms, but I'm trying to build from the ground upwards, and I have a lot to say on things like the dollar, the global American empire, the global economic system in the post World War II, post Bretton Woods era, these sorts of topics, central banking, fiat currency, I think this broader circle of ideas, really. So yeah, that's how I arrived here.
Have you heard of Harry Brown before?
Harry Brown? No, it's not a name I'm familiar with.
So he was the presidential nominee for the Libertarian Party in '96 and 2000. Actually, the last Libertarian presidential candidate was his running mate in '96, Joe Jorgensen, if you've heard that name. And anyway, the thing that I mentioned it for, you mentioned 9/11, and immediately what I think of when it comes to dissidents. Right after 9/11, you can imagine the fervor for war in America. It led to Afghanistan, later Iraq. Harry Brown wrote an article, 9/12/2001, saying that we asked for it by our interventions. Can you imagine? In the New York Times.
I will look that up because those are definitely views that I resonate with, to be honest with you. And I think libertarians have always been, some of the original dissidents, to be honest with you, in their ideas and their thinking and just their bravery, to be honest with you, not sort of, selling out to, the broader kind of two-party political kind of divide we have, but making their own peace and standing alone but standing together. So there's a lot of crossover in dissident circles with the Libertarian Party, the Libertarian movement, I should say. And a lot of their thinkers, they still influence me today. I was reading Mo Rothbard's Case Against the Fed just last week, so there's definitely a lot of overlap there. And to your point, the sentence you were saying, I think decades of US foreign policy really did sort of lead to, those unfortunate events in New York City, and the Pentagon as well, and Pennsylvania. Although that's maybe a bit of a not too broad brush strokes, I would tend to agree with that. Yeah.
I think there's no question that was clearly this, in Osama bin Laden's own words. He said, we did 9/11 for this, and this. And the occupation of Saudi Arabia, support of Israel, those are things that are factual. But Harry Brown being bold the day after 9/11, when everyone is on the total opposite track, he was my first political hero and also my first presidential vote, which ages me. My first vote was 2000, voting for Harry Brown. So that's the way back for me. And then Ron Paul in 08 and 12. There's some more in the modern era, but those are my two guys that really politically influenced me. And then Rothbard with the actual ideology, I think, is probably my core. But yeah, that's intriguing. I want you to tell me, generally speaking, when you think of modernity now, tell me where your mind goes. I want to know, take me down the rabbit hole. When you're thinking about how things are in our current world and our current state of things, how do you evaluate that?
Yeah, I mean, modernity is, when I think of the word, it takes me down several different rabbit holes at once. I think, it encompasses so much. I think there's a lot of things about the culture. You think about just the way people live, the media, the entertainment industry, things such as technology, the 24-hour news cycle. All these things have impacted the broader culture tremendously. And, modernity 50, 60 years ago was, originally 80, 90 years ago, it was the radio, then it was television, then it was color television. Now we have so many different influences. I think it brings up a lot to do with people, really, how we live our lives, our standards, how they've dropped, how they've declined, the broader world around us. We think about this sort of integrated world where, the free movement of goods, people, capital, services, which we were told several decades ago would be great for prosperity, great for freedom, great for people. But has it really been? Have we crossed a line in the sand where these things are no longer a net positive and are actually a net negative? And I would tend to agree. So I mean, I'm kind of quite a traditionalist in many ways. So squaring that with modernity is hard. Look, we're broadcasting live on several platforms now using laptops and microphones and built-in video recorders. I mean, it's we're kind of all hypocrites at the same time. We love some of the conveniences and the luxuries of modernity, but I think we crossed a line in the sand a while back ago, at least a decade ago. And I think this is taking us down some dangerous routes. I think of a French philosopher I know of, Jacques Ellul, who was writing in the late 70s, the early 80s, and he had this idea of technique, and he saw modern civilization all down this path of really being consumed by the technology around us, and the more we're subjugated to technology and things, the more our essential humanity gets diluted. The culture gets saturated. We lose who we are. And, I think those are some wishy-washy ideas, but I think they're very pertinent and they resonate with me. And I often find a lot of people from the right as well. So, yeah.
Do you find it that maybe it's not as much as the tools, but how the tools are being utilized? So it's cultural decay rather than the modernity of things when it comes to actual material things. It's more about the culture and how they utilize the modernity.
Absolutely. Yeah, I totally agree with that. 100%. Let's be honest. I don't think everybody should be locked in a small room reading 18th century literature. If people want to play a bit of video games, they want to listen to some music, whatever, that's fine. Now, the problem we have, Matthew, is when a lot of Gen Z decide to play video games for 8 hours a day. Do you know what I mean? It's these sorts of things. I like a burger and fries, but not every day. I spend most of the week preparing and cooking my own food. I know you're quite big into that as well. healthy living. But when you're having the burger and fries every day, along with the video games, along with some of the other sort of temptations, I think you go down a dangerous kind of spiral. I think it's this concept of negative freedom. John Jacques Rousseau said, freedom is nothing without discipline, and we need discipline to control our desires, to control our sort of primordial, sort of visceral self, if you want, because if left unchecked, humanity will just pursue hedonistic pleasures and desires all the time. And I think you're absolutely right. It's the lack of discipline which has led to this sort of the state of modernity, and the negative freedom that says, well, if I don't have unlimited streaming, unlimited video games, opioids, porn, then that's not good, and that's impinging on my freedom, and something I'm very much against. And I'm not sure how we regain that. I don't know how we sort of get that back, so to speak.
Let me suggest something to you. Here's an idea I have about this, and I want to run it by you. So, there's a quote that I don't want to butcher, but the quote about hard times, strong men, and then good times, weak men. Okay, so if we have hard times, which in my personal opinion, and I want to get into this more when we talk about money and the fiat money system and things next time we talk, but if things were to go to hell, and we have a big problem in our world, country, depending on how you look at it, the U.S. with the Federal Reserve System, the world reserve currency can be an additional obstacle for the U.S. where it was a benefit all these years. And then you go to around the world, they have these fiat banking systems and central banks. Do you think that hard times breeding strong men where people have to do their own work, or these kind of things that might come with hard times, might shift to the kind of culture you and I might revere?
I think so. I mean, I think it's hard to, I think we're kind of almost in Western countries, in industrialized countries, we're almost sort of drunk off of the freedom and the prosperity that generations before us fought hard to build, and, we sort of live in this world where, it's all based around our luxuries and our material, luxuries and conveniences. And, I mean, I know, we were talking off camera, you've traveled a lot. I have too. And you go to other parts of the world and, they're not consumed with modernity. It isn't about iPhones and Netflix. They have their families, they have their church, or what other place of worship. They have their communities. They put food on the table and they're satisfied. I think any big sort of economic depression, any big downturn caused by either the currency crashing or, I don't know, inflation, I dare say hyperinflation or anything like that, much less a war or a conflict, an actual open conflict. I think, our problems are going to be multiplied, because I think there's generations of people that just, they will not be able to deal with it, not in the real sense or the existential concept, idea of it either. I think it's really going to be very hard. I mean, I think we've seen during the pandemic, Western countries, I mean, we don't manufacture, we don't produce the essentials, we import everything. Instead, we provide these tertiary financial and legal services, but when a crisis really hits and you need food, you need raw materials and things, our societies, our economies aren't geared in that direction. Whereas places, such as Turkey, China, India, these places, they're much more used to being self-sufficient. They seem to have those essential building blocks which will take them through the hard times, whereas we're going to be worried about our iPhones and our Netflix and our food deliveries, our apps. And, I personally don't think that's very healthy at all. I think the consequences, if a real crisis would hit, and I think we had a taste of that during the pandemic, if a real crisis, global crisis would hit, would bring a lot of these problems to the forefront. I feel,
You got me in two directions on this. You've got me on two things I want to get you with. One in particular I want to focus on first is Korea, because you and I have both lived in Korea for about 9 years. Secondarily, I'm going to do a two-part question here, so you can run with both however you wish. China, you mentioned China, and I think that China actually, other than the reserve system that we have with the dollar, I think that China is probably in a worse, more rapid declining situation than the United States. If it wasn't for the dollar being the reserve currency, it's my only variable I'm not sure about being even more catastrophic. That's a unique thing for the United States to deal with that I'm very concerned about. But talk to me about Korea. To me, when I look at Korea, I think it was a rapidly developing culture. So you've had a cultural revolution happening more rapidly, and I think that a lot of their men have become softer than American men, honestly, already.
I agree,
So I think that's a rapid, you could say, increase in standard of living, decline in maybe the ruggedness of men. And then in China, I don't know enough. I'm curious what your perception is there. I think they probably are more equipped to survive, but I think that they're more of a bubble economy than even we are. If it wasn't for all those dollars flooding back home, if the world reserve currency came. Run with those two.
I mean, China, there's a very famous saying, I'm sure you've heard of it, China is a threat, not because of its strengths, but because of its weaknesses. And, you mentioned the dollar. I mean, maybe, like you said, this is a different conversation for another day, but just quickly on that issue, I mean, yes, they've grown prosperous and they've off of, the Chimerica relationship, being tied to the dollar and the US being the biggest export market for China's exports and things. But, if the dollar declines, if the dollar devalues, then that disproportionately affects China and their huge portfolio of dollar-denominated assets, which would also correspondingly decline in value as well. If America cut back on imports, that's going to negatively affect China, the other East Asian export-driven economies as well. So, it's very much a gift and a curse. On the one hand, they've built up their military, they've built up huge foreign currency reserves. They've also built up their infrastructure, and I've been on a lot of it. The biggest dams, the tallest bridges, highways that stretch from one part of the country to another. Bullet trains in Shanghai, and that's fantastic and well done to them. But there is it's a double-sided, it's a double-ended sword. In many ways, and they have labor surplus is a big problem in China. One of the biggest problems in the East is that they basically overproduce. That's why a lot of consumer goods, kettles, toasters, hair dryers, these things, but even laptops and things, that's why they're readily available. They're very cheap because in China, but also Taiwan, also Japan, they're basically overproducing, and that's because labor surplus is a really big structural problem in China. There are basically not enough jobs, not enough factories to support, particularly the male-dominated, labor workforce, but I think females as well. So there are a lot of problems there. And in a case of the COVID pandemic, well, if countries scale back on imports, that's going to affect China. There's no way that it isn't, Matthew. When you have an economy that is so geared, so based around export-led industries, it's always going to be an issue. Now they have huge foreign currency reserves that they can call upon in order to soften the blow as well. So I think that's also very important. I think there's a lot of issues in that regard. Yeah, Korea. I mean, obviously for our viewers, I mean we're talking about South Korea, Republic of Korea. So we've both been there. I would tend to agree with you. When I came to Korea, I think they had the highest rate of savings amongst the OECD countries. But I think now in 2022, I think I'm right in saying it's flipped. I think they have the highest amount of household debt. When I first came, it was definitely a lot more traditional based on the family. But I think modernity has had a really crushing effect on South Korea, especially the young people. They don't really have the same opportunities that perhaps were budding in the 90s and the early noughties and things. Inflation, cost of living, these things have gone up. Of course, Korea sits on top of a dual kind of crisis. They've got the pensions crisis, and they've also got the birth rate problem. They're not having enough offspring in order to sustain their pension system, the tax base, and so on and so forth. And they're dealing with issues of inflation. I think they're going to do a straight swap with the Federal Reserve. I mean, I don't know about. I remember Matthew, when I first came to Korea, it was 900 won to the dollar, but I believe it's now a record 12 or 1300 won. And when Korea has so much trade with the US, there's going to be issues there. There's going to be, I think, there's going to be big structural issues in the economy, and I think young people, unfortunately, are going to, bear most of the consequences and things. They already have a housing bubble and things, and China is a big existential threat as well. There's so much investment there. I speak to many people in Korea who think it's gone too far. I'm sure you're familiar with Jeju Island, the resort island off of the south coast, and I think China just owns huge chunks of that. A bit like how they do in Sydney, Australia, and in Vancouver, in Canada. They buy into real estate, inflate the prices of property and real estate, and they consolidate power in that way. The American empire didn't really do that, even at its height. It didn't really encroach in those ways. But the checkbook diplomacy, as they say, it has many shades. And lastly, in terms of the cultural impact, the feminization of the men is observable. All the makeup that you get for men now and things.
The BTS.
BTS. Yeah, I'm not sure how I feel about that. I mean, I think we're from a similar generation. I guess we'll maybe touch on some of the culture wars and things a bit later. But I just think a lot of people. I see those pictures of those K-pop bands, and I'm just like. That seems to be antithetical to human nature and the male gene, and and it's funny how the young people have so taken in by it. But I think there's something about that doesn't sit well with me. I don't know about you, but
same for me. I've talked about this with many BTS fans, where it's taken hold here, mostly young girls, but they really like the BTS band in the United States. There's a whole group. I think some have similar feelings to me, but it's a mixed bag anyway. And they're talented guys and everything, but it's just the image is something that I don't quite understand. It's beyond me, I guess you would say. I'm not sure if your camera's off. Oh, there it goes again. So anyway, for China, I think China is kind of a paper tiger. I think that all this leverage they have in New Zealand and Australia and Canada and the United States, Korea, with all this property, UK, I think there's a massive bubble in their debt structure because of their fiat currency, their centralized banks. They have ghost cities. They've spent all this money. I just can't help but wonder that they might have way too much leverage there, that it might all come tumbling down.
I agree. I mean, I think it's the same case in India. I think, I've been to China. I've spent several months traveling across the country. You know, I've got to say, from a cultural, historical perspective, it's a great place. So much to see. They have an ancient culture, a successful culture, and it's worth to go there at least once.
Yeah.
But what I would say is that there are. What you find is that there's a great disparity of wealth. You see this in India as well. You see huge concentrations of wealth in the coastal regions and a few central cities. You've got Guangzhou, Shenzhen, Shanghai, and they have Western standards of living. Wuhan, Chongqing, Chengdu, I think, as well, Xi'an. And they've got these huge shopping malls, and it's great, and that's fantastic. They've got metros and all kinds of things. But then you go into some of the inner provinces and things, and it's not quite as bright and rosy. And I think one thing that's happening is a lot of people in those areas they have internet, they have laptops, and they're seeing all this prosperity, and they're saying, well, you know what, we want a piece of this as well. We're part of the project too. You need to be fed and everything, and you need the raw materials, the food and the natural resources, and we don't have the skyrise buildings of the Pudong skyline in Shanghai and things like that. And I think there is you see this in the developed world as well, huge concentrations of capital, of growth, of economy, and outside of that it's still very agrarian and rural based sort of economies and localities and things, whereas I feel in the West it's it's a bit more of an even spread, I think, in many, so especially in the United States. I mean, there are many cities that sit on par with each other. You could say that New York is maybe a sort of top of that thing, maybe to some degree Los Angeles and Chicago, but beneath that there's every state has a handful that you can name, and Europe to some degree is similar. But I think it's funny. Yeah, paper tiger, definitely. I mean, like I said, for these export industries, export-driven economies, I think it's good up to a point. But I think there's huge questions. I mean, we've seen with Huawei and all sorts of things. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I'm not too comfortable. Some foreign direct investments, okay, but I'm not too comfortable when I see these fee-paying schools, Matthew, in the UK, and they're basically being sustained by capital from China, from from their particularly Chinese students and things like that. And it makes me uncomfortable, if I'm being honest. I think one of the problems I have with the global economic system is in the UK, so much of the country's beholden to foreign money, property, finance, football, industry, you name it. And there's all kinds of foreign interests there, Russian, Middle Eastern, Chinese, American as well, Indian to some degree. And I'm not sure. I don't think it's not a system I particularly favour, if I'm being honest. It looks good on the surface, maybe, but I don't think it's sustainable, and it's not one that I would favour personally.
It makes me wonder if it's legitimate. Like, is all this money leveraged in some way? Like, obviously, they have a lot of money coming in from the United States, for example, where then they're getting back all these lower cost goods because they're manufactured in China, and they're holding all those dollars, and they have dollars to buy things or buy things in other countries using the reserve currency. I'm just not sure that it's real. I feel like, is it going to be suddenly where everything comes undone? Real estate prices in all these areas tank. When we come in, I think we're on the verge now here of that global recession, depression. The U.S. I worry about a lot because of the reserve currency when it comes to inflation. If all that money comes home, which China I think would wish for, it also hurts them too, because with all their debt, they lose that $1 trillion. Oh, inflation.
Absolutely. You've articulated it perfectly. The problem is, I think, in terms of the dollar, is so many major economies have so much to lose in what we are now in the first quarter of the 21st century. I mean, the problem is for countries like China, also Japan, is they have huge portfolios of dollar-denominated assets, in particularly treasury bonds and debt securities, for which they're paid sort of minimal interest for holding from the US. And yes, if all those dollars were to come flooding back to American shores, it would lead to an economic catastrophe. But everybody would fall, and all those dollar-denominated assets that Japan, China, other countries hold are going to depreciate in value as well. So when the dollar devalues, so do their foreign currency reserves, so do their assets. It has collateral damage in many ways. I mean, some people have termed this the dollar weapon. In the 70s, there was the talk of the oil weapon. But you could also, to the same effect, speak of the dollar weapon as well. If it gets devalued, and if America sort of cuts off supply of dollars to overseas, that's going to impact the global economy, which runs on dollars. Let's face it. So I'm kind of repeating myself, but it's a double-ended sword. But a lot of people have reference. I mean, Putin, for example, Vladimir Putin has for many years now. I mean, since the 90s, has referenced this. I mean, in France in the 60s, Charles de Gaulle referred to it as the exorbitant privilege of the US, as having the world's reserve currency. Barry Eichmann, whose book of the same name, Exorbitant Privilege, I'm reading now. I thoroughly recommend for a brief, concise history of the US dollar. Said, he put it perfectly, whereas other countries have to stump up $100 of real goods and services, the US just goes to the mint and prints a bill. But obviously, if they lose control of the system, the inflationary effects of that, hyperinflation, and is looms large in a way.
You hit the nail on the head. That's what I was getting at. That's a good thing. This is what I want to drill down on next time. Is that I want to get into how this will be affecting things. But long story short of it is paying the piper. All this lavish living off of the dollar being the reserve currency, where you can monetize all this debt at the expense of people. Yeah.
Dude, we might have to cut this. I've got so much on this. What I'm doing, Matthew, I'm literally when we say goodbye, I'm getting back to the writing because I've got to finish the Bretton Woods article. But I've got so much on this, dude. I've probably got 10,000 words. I need to write. I need to organize it for the Substack, for Praxarchy, for our work, for other work I do on the future. The thing is, what you've got to understand, Matthew, is that OPEC and China, they benefit enormously off of this because they both get to run. They both have a surplus. And China's not building. Trump touched upon this in the 2016 campaign. China's not going to have this huge military with, fleet destroyers and aircraft carriers. OPEC's not going to have this surplus without their relationship with the dollar. So with OPEC, it's the petrodollar, and with China, it's the same, but it's the same kind of rehash system. So, oil transactions are conducted in dollars. So are coffee and gold, by the way, and many other commodities. And OPEC takes a portion of those profits and they buy US debt, treasuries, and securities, which underwrites US overheads, US debts, and allows Washington to keep on running these massive deficits. But that in turn allows them to carry on buying oil from OPEC, buying consumer goods from China. If China and OPEC and Japan, and OPEC did not buy up these debt securities, America wouldn't be able to trade with them to the extent they do. They would lose their biggest export market. And as a result, China wouldn't have these surpluses, either would OPEC. And if China didn't have these surpluses, they wouldn't have the biggest dams, the Three Gorges Dam. They wouldn't have the highways. They wouldn't have the bullet trains. They wouldn't have any of these things. Japan is a bit is a bit different because they're cushioned by decades of surpluses because of exports in the 70s, the 80s. Consumer goods are a lot more expensive then, Matthew. I mean, even on a basic fundamental level, you go to your parents 30 years ago, if you needed a new kettle, if you needed a new radio, it was a big deal. It wasn't like it was now. I'd go on Amazon, let's get some cheap one. You needed a television. So you remember VCR players, remember how much they used to cost and things. The global economy has changed because now we have overproduction. We have basically surplus goods, and it's going to drive the cost of everything down. Jeff Rubin is a Canadian author. He's written this book I thoroughly recommend. It's called The Expendables, and it deals with the nature of global trade. And basically what we did is we reduced wages, and those were offset in two different directions. People at the top of the pyramid got wider profit margins, they got bigger profits, bottom line profits and things, and consumers got cheaper goods. But the loser was the worker, Matthew. They got reduced salaries. I would strongly recommend a lot of our listeners to check that very well-written, lucid book out, The Expendables by Jeff Rubin. And these things are cyclical. When you deal with economics, a lot of the time it is cyclical. The economy goes in cycles, peaks and troughs, and boom and bust, and things like that. And it's fair to say we're probably on the downslope at the moment with all the inflationary pressure and things, and there's many externalities, which Russia, Ukraine, and the global pandemic, and there's other forces at work as well. So
I agree with everything you're saying here, and there's so many rabbit holes to go down. I don't even know where to begin, which I know the dollar will be a good place to pick up next time. And I really thank you for doing this, because it's a great start. I think we should dive more into the dollar next time. I think that you're right. I think the inflation is the killer. I think, long story short, to wrap on this, is I think the inflation will eventually really, really hurt China in particular, is what I wanted to focus on, because all these treasury bonds they're buying are going down in value as the inflation occurs. Yeah, but I think that's always been the core.
Yeah, right. All their assets. I mean, I mean, since Nixon removed the gold peg in 1971, and all currencies became floating fiat currencies because the dollar was the world's reserve currency at the time. It basically forced all the other currencies to assume the same state so they could expand without the constraints of being tied to a metallic base, to another commodity, gold, silver, if you want to go back to the days of William Jennings Bryan, who advocated, a double kind of peg, and, go back even as far as Andrew Jackson and things. But this was always the danger. Now we just have infinite credit expansion. You have things like fractional reserve banking, which for our listeners, some will know, but, where banks are allowed to lend far beyond what they can actually secure in real holdings and currency. There's so many aspects. I think what this conversation shows, Matthew, is that all these issues are tied together. Do you know what I mean? And
I knew where you were going.
Yeah, together. You talk about the culture and things and the decline in standards. You're not too many deviations away from currency and inflation and the role of central banks and so on, and governments as well, and things. So it's all tied together. But I think first and foremost is you've got to get your mind on these issues, the real issues, not the baloney that the mainstream media puts in our news feeds and our newspapers. We've got to be
for sure. I think that the other thing we should dive on is how people's living standards have maybe declined with the inflation. Like, people think, oh, my house is going up in value on paper, but things that this inflation and the distortions of government might lead to a higher cost of living, with things like education, housing, healthcare. All these monies pour into these sectors. So actually,
Yeah.
deflationary costs would be a good thing. If wages are falling but costs are falling faster, your standard of
Yeah.
living is rising. So right now, I think that's
Absolutely.
the core.
We're being
Yeah.
robbed through inflation. And in my humble opinion, I mean, we could say 1913, passing of the Federal Reserve Act. But yeah, I mean, I would probably go a bit further. I'd say 1971 and the removal of the gold peg. But yeah, we are being robbed through inflation. And we have been since, to be honest, before you and I were even born. And, you know, the dollar has lost so much of its real value, but so has the pound sterling and many of the other currencies in circulation. And you're right. I mean, you know, the interesting thing is, the funny thing is, you know, yes, consumer goods are more readily available. You know, you need a hairdryer, you need a toaster, that's fine. But the things that really impact our life, like healthcare, like education, like property, they've all spiraled in value, you know. And, you know, one of the things about inflation, you know, when there's excess money in the system, when interest rates are too low, you know, assets shoot up in value, you know, property, real estate. And, you know, that is, you know, a big side effect of these policies, of these monetary policies. And, you know, you come back to that Murray Rothbard's, you know, what has the government done to our money, you know, and that, you know, it's as relevant now as ever, especially during inflationary sessions, you know, periods. You know, we've got to remind ourselves of these basics, of these fundamentals. And normies think they're getting a good deal because that DVD is cheaper, or, you know, whatever. My silly television is a bit cheaper, but in the long run, no. We're not actually. We're all being fleeced by this global economic system, which homogenizes the world, sees the infinite movement of goods, capital, people, and labor. And yeah, it's a problem, and it's one we should unpack in future hangouts.
Let's wrap this up. Next time, let's get into the money, and also how the money and maybe China and the import exports, how they get into how people's standard of living could be rising, but things are actually falling. So we'll get into that more next time. Thank you again so much, Justin. And I'll talk to you a little bit more offline. You have a good evening there in England, and we'll keep this conversation going.
Absolutely. It was great talking today. I hope the viewers enjoyed it, and we touched on a lot of good ground, and I look forward to the next one.
Thank you so much.
Bye, guys.
Have a good one, everyone.